I will never forget the sound of 47 beings holding their breath at the same time. It was not a gasp, it was not a murmur. It was the sudden absence of all sound, as though the room itself had flinched. I was sitting in the third row of Advanced Hull Integrity Theory, my datapad open, my notes halfway finished, and every nerve in my body frozen because a human had just asked the most dangerous question I had ever heard in my life. My name is Sorith Kine. I am Valith, born on the oceanic world of Dravan, and at the time of this story, I was a second-year student at the Naval Lyceum on Korath Station, the most prestigious warship design academy in the Galactic Union. 32 species sent their brightest minds to study there. The Dralith dominated theoretical engineering. The Torvan excelled in weapons integration. My own people, the Valith, were considered the gold standard in hull architecture, and I carried that expectation on my shoulders every single day. Then there was the human. His name was Grant Calloway. He had arrived 6 weeks earlier as part of a diplomatic exchange program, the first human ever admitted to the Lyceum. He was tall by most species standards, with short brown hair and a face that rarely showed emotion. He sat in the back of every class. He took notes by hand, scratching marks onto physical paper with a thin stick of graphite, which half the students found amusing and the other half found baffling. In 6 weeks, he had spoken exactly 4 times, all of them to ask for clarification on unit conversions. He was polite, he was quiet. Nobody took him seriously. Humans were new to the galactic stage. Their fleet was tiny, their territory modest, their technology generations behind the major powers. Admitting Calloway to the Lyceum was widely understood as a gesture of goodwill, a diplomatic courtesy extended to a species that would need another century to matter. The faculty treated him with careful politeness. The students barely noticed him at all. Until that morning. Professor Yaeth Morin stood at the front of the hall, his forearms folded behind his back, in the way Dralith do when they are feeling particularly proud. He was a legend. He had served on the design team for the current generation of the Sovereign-class battleship, the most powerful and most survivable capital ship ever fielded by the Galactic Union. 300 years of iterative design had gone into that vessel. It was the backbone of every major fleet. It was considered by every serious military analyst in the galaxy to be functionally invincible against any known threat. Yaeth had every right to be proud. He had helped build perfection. The holographic display behind him showed a full cross-section of the Sovereign class, rotating slowly, every armor layer visible in translucent blue. Yaeth was walking us through the triple redundant plating system, explaining how each layer served a different function. The outer shell absorbed kinetic impacts. The middle lattice dispersed energy weapon discharge. The inner core maintained structural integrity, even if the outer 2 layers were completely destroyed. It was elegant. It was brilliant. Every student in the room was taking careful notes. I was sketching the lattice geometry when I heard the sound of a chair scraping back. I looked up. Calloway was standing. His notebook was closed. He was not looking at his notes. He was looking at the hologram. Yaeth noticed him after a moment and paused mid-sentence. There was a flicker of surprise on his face. Calloway had never voluntarily spoken in class before. "You have a question?" Yaeth asked, his tone patient, but clearly not expecting anything significant. "Yes, sir," Calloway said. His voice was calm and steady, and it carried across the hall with a clarity that made everyone turn. "May I approach the display?" Yaeth gestured him forward, more curious now than anything else. Calloway walked down the center aisle, past rows of students from a dozen species, and stopped in front of the rotating hologram. He studied it for a moment, tilting his head slightly to one side. Then he reached out and touched the projection, rotating it himself until the ventral aspect of the ship faced the room. He pointed to a section along the ventral spine. It ran between the reactor housing and the secondary shield emitters, a strip roughly 4 meters wide and 20 meters long. The armor there was not absent, but it was visibly thinner than the surrounding sections. Where the rest of the hull showed 3 full layers, this section showed only 2, and the inner layer was narrower than standard. "Why is your battleship missing armor here?" Calloway asked. The room died. I do not mean the room grew quiet. I mean the room died. Every whispered conversation stopped. Every stylus froze above every datapad. I watched a Torvon student in the front row open his mouth and then close it again without making a sound. Beside me, my classmate Ilvin, who always had something to say about everything, sat absolutely still, with her eyes locked on the hologram. I looked at the strip Calloway was pointing to. I had studied the Sovereign class for 2 years. I had memorized its schematics. I had written a 12-page analysis of its armor geometry for my qualifying examination. And I had never, not once, noticed what Calloway was pointing at. Nobody had. Yates recovered quickly, because he was a professional and because he had spent decades fielding questions from skeptics and rivals. He stepped forward and adjusted the hologram to show the internal layout behind the strip. "That is a thermal regulation corridor," Yates said, his voice steady and instructional. "The reactor housing generates significant heat during sustained combat operations. The section you are indicating serves as a heat dispersal pathway, allowing thermal energy to radiate outward through the hull rather than building up internally. Reducing the armor density in that section was a calculated design decision to prevent reactor overheating during prolonged engagements." It was a good answer. It was a technically accurate answer. Several students nodded along, satisfied. Calloway did not nod. He stood there for a moment, looking at the hologram, and then he turned to face Yath directly. "So you left a kill strip on your flagship because it gets warm?" he said. His voice had not changed. There was no mockery in it, no hostility. He asked it the way someone might ask why a bridge had no railing, not to insult the builders, to understand why they had made a choice that seemed, to him, obviously dangerous. Yaeth's composure cracked. Not dramatically. Not in a way most people would have noticed, but I was sitting close enough to see his secondary arms tighten behind his back and his pupils contract in the way Draelith eyes do when they are processing something that does not fit their existing framework. He had not expected that response. He had expected the explanation to end the conversation. "The thermal requirements are non-negotiable," Yaeth said, more carefully now. "Without that dispersal pathway, the reactor would exceed safe operating thresholds within 40 minutes of sustained combat. The armor reduction in that section was the minimum necessary compromise." "I understand the constraint," Calloway said. "I am asking why the solution was to thin the armor rather than redesign the thermal system." The murmuring started then. Not loud, but everywhere, like a vibration running through the room. Students were looking at each other. Some were looking at the hologram with new eyes, studying the strip as though seeing it for the first time. Others were looking at Calloway the way you might look at someone who had just casually pointed out that the ground beneath your feet was not solid. Yaeth began to speak again, something about legacy architecture constraints and retrofit limitations, but I was no longer listening to him. I was watching Calloway walk back to his seat. He sat down, opened his notebook, and began sketching something with that primitive graphite stick. I was close enough to see the page. He was drawing a trajectory arc, 3 curved lines, converging from different angles, all terminating at the same point on a simplified outline of the Sovereign's ventral hull. Each line was labeled with a small notation I could not read from my angle, but the geometry was unmistakable. It was a weapons solution, a firing pattern designed to hit that exact strip from multiple vectors simultaneously. He had not asked the question because he did not understand the design. He had asked because he already knew what that strip meant. He had known the moment he saw it, and he wanted to see if anyone else in the room understood what he understood. I looked at the hologram still rotating at the front of the hall. The Sovereign-class battleship, pride of the Galactic Union, the ship that had kept the peace for 3 centuries. And there it was, plain as daylight now that someone had pointed it out. A thin line of vulnerability running along the belly of the most powerful warship ever built. I looked back at Calloway. He was still sketching, his face calm, his posture relaxed. He looked like a student doing homework. He did not look like someone who had just shaken the foundations of an entire civilization's military doctrine. But he had. And the worst part, the part that kept me awake that night and many nights after, was the realization that sat like cold metal in my chest. He had found it in 6 weeks. Not by running simulations. Not by accessing classified data. He had found it by sitting in the back of a classroom and looking at a hologram, the same hologram that thousands of students and engineers and admirals had studied before him. He saw what none of them had seen, because he was not looking at the ship the way we looked at ships. We looked at the Sovereign and saw strength. We saw 300 years of engineering excellence. We saw armor and shields and firepower, and we felt safe. Calloway looked at the Sovereign and saw a target. He saw a body with organs and bones and joints, and he looked for the place where a single, precise strike would bring the whole thing down. That night, alone in my quarters, I pulled up the Sovereign-class schematics on my personal terminal and stared at the ventral strip for a long time. Then I did something I had never done before. I tried to look at the ship the way Calloway looked at it. Not as a marvel of engineering, not as a protector, but as something that could be killed. I found 3 more weak points in under an hour. I did not sleep at all. The next morning, I expected the whole thing to have been forgotten. Academic arguments flared up constantly at the Lyceum, and most of them burned out within a day. A bold question from a junior student, even a human, was hardly the kind of thing that would survive the overnight cycle of gossip and counter-gossip that defined life on Korath Station. I was wrong. By the time I reached the dining hall for first meal, every table was buzzing with the same conversation. Calloway's question had spread through the student body like a disease. Fragments of the exchange had been recorded on personal devices and shared across every social channel on the station. The original phrasing, the one that everyone kept repeating, had already hardened into a kind of catchphrase. "Why is your battleship missing armor here?" I heard it whispered in the food line, debated at tables of senior students, dissected in corridor arguments between Drelith theorists and Torvon weapons specialists. Some students defended the design. The thermal argument was sound, they said. Every warship required compromises. The Sovereign had proven itself in decades of service, and no enemy had ever exploited the ventral strip. Others were less certain. A group of Valith structural engineers had apparently spent the entire night running independent simulations, and the preliminary results were making them nervous. Nobody would tell me the specifics, but the expressions on their faces said enough. By midday, the faculty responded. A notice appeared on the Lyceum network announcing that Professor Yaeth Morin would hold an extended seminar that afternoon on Sovereign-class hull philosophy, open to all students and faculty. It was framed as an educational opportunity, a deeper exploration of the design principles discussed in class. Nobody was fooled. This was damage control. Calloway was specifically listed as an invited attendee. I went, of course. Morbid curiosity is a powerful motivator, and I told myself that as a future hull architect, I had a professional obligation to understand the controversy. But the truth was simpler than that. I wanted to see what would happen when Calloway and Yaeth faced each other again, this time with the whole Lyceum watching. The seminar hall was standing room only. I arrived early enough to claim a seat near the front, and by the time the session began, students were lining the walls and sitting in the aisles. Yaeth had brought reinforcements. 2 senior naval architects from the Union Fleet Bureau sat beside him on the platform, their credentials displayed on the wall screen behind them. Between them sat a Torvon I recognized from historical archives, a retired admiral named Dreth Kosak, who had commanded a Sovereign-class battleship during the Pale Corridor campaigns 40 years ago. Kosak was old and scarred, and radiated the kind of authority that comes from having survived things that should have ended him. Calloway sat in the front row. His notebook was open. His expression was neutral. Yaeth began with a presentation that was clearly the product of an entire night's preparation. He walked through the Sovereign's design history from its earliest prototype 3 centuries ago, through every iterative revision. He showed thermal load calculations, structural flex tolerances, the trade-off matrices that had shaped each generation of the design. He demonstrated mathematically that reducing the ventral armor was not merely a convenience but a necessity, and that the alternatives, rerouting the thermal system, adding external radiators, redesigning the reactor, would each introduce worse vulnerabilities than the one they solved. The math was impeccable. The logic was airtight. By the time he finished, the room was nodding along, and I could feel the collective anxiety beginning to ease. Then Yaeth turned to Calloway and invited him to respond. Calloway closed his notebook and stood. He walked to the front of the hall, and this time there was no hesitation in his stride. He asked permission to use the holographic display. Yathith granted it with a generous gesture, clearly confident that his presentation had settled the matter. "I want to be clear," Calloway said, facing the audience. "Professor Morin's thermal analysis is correct. The ventral strip exists because the reactor needs that dispersal pathway, and within the existing architecture, there is no better solution. I am not arguing that the designers made an error. I am arguing that the design philosophy has a blind spot." He activated the display. A Sovereign-class battleship appeared in the air, rotating slowly. But Calloway had overlaid something new, a tactical grid that showed weapons approach vectors. "I am going to run a scenario," he said. 3 torpedo-class munitions, standard yield, staggered at 0.4-second intervals, targeted in a convergent pattern on the ventral strip. He entered the parameters and let the simulation run. The room watched as 3 red lines arced toward the holographic ship. The first torpedo struck the ventral strip and overloaded the localized shield coverage, which was weaker there because the thinner armor generated less structural feedback for the shield emitters to anchor to. The second torpedo hit the exposed plating while the shields were still cycling and cracked through both remaining armor layers. The third torpedo, arriving less than a second after the first, passed through the breach and detonated against the reactor housing. The holographic Sovereign-class battleship broke apart from the inside. The simulation timer read 1.2 seconds from first impact to reactor breach. Calloway let the silence hold for a long moment. Then he said, "The most survivable capital ship in the Galactic Union dies in 1.2 seconds." The room erupted. Not in anger, not yet, but in the kind of chaotic noise that happens when a large number of very intelligent people all realize the same terrible thing at the same moment. Admiral Cossack was on his feet, his massive frame blocking the view of half the front row. "That scenario is theoretically possible," Cossack said, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years of fleet command. "But it is tactically absurd. No fleet doctrine in the galaxy calls for that kind of precision targeting on a single hull section during active combat. The firing solution alone would require computational resources that no weapons platform currently in service could provide in real time." Calloway turned to face the Admiral with a respect that was genuine but not deferential. "Your fleet doctrine does not call for it," he said. "Mine does." The room went quiet again, but this was a different kind of quiet. The first silence had been shock. This was something colder. Calloway pulled up a new display. This one did not show Union technology. It showed historical data from Earth, translated into standard galactic notation. Naval engagements from centuries before humans had ever left their homeworld. He showed them something called a torpedo bulkhead analysis from a conflict fought entirely on liquid water. He showed them how human warship designers had learned, through catastrophic losses, that a single well-placed projectile could break a vessel that was otherwise heavily armored. He showed them how human naval doctrine had evolved around a single, relentless principle: find the geometry of the kill shot. "Every warship has a kill geometry," Calloway said. "A specific angle of attack, a specific weapon type, a specific sequence of impacts that will destroy it faster than any other approach. The first thing any human weapons officer is trained to do is identify that geometry for every enemy vessel they might face. We do not fire at ships. We fire at the specific point on a ship where one shot does the work of 100. He let that sink in. The room was absolutely still. Then he continued, pulling up another historical example, this one from a conflict humans called a world war, fought with metal ships on an ocean of water. He showed them how a warship with armor plating many centimeters thick had been sunk by a weapon that struck from above, plunging down at a steep angle to hit the deck, which was thinner than the sides, because the designers had not anticipated attacks from that trajectory. When the enemy discovered this, they redesigned their weapons to arc high and fall steeply, turning the entire surface of the ocean into a kill zone for ships that had armored themselves only against horizontal threats. He showed them another case, a fortified position on a small island in the middle of an ocean, considered by its builders to be impregnable from the sea. The enemy did not attack from the sea. They came through dense vegetation from the landward side, a direction the fortress guns could not traverse because the builders had assumed no force could approach from there. The fortress fell in days. "The pattern is always the same," Calloway said. The builders assume their strength is absolute. The attacker finds the assumption and breaks it. The fortress that guards against every attack except the one that comes will fall to the one that comes, always. He paused and looked at Yath, and in that moment, I saw something I had never seen before on the professor's face. It was not embarrassment. It was the slow, dawning recognition that an entire field of knowledge he had mastered was built on an assumption he had never questioned. The Union builds ships to survive broadly, Calloway said. You make everything strong and trust that strength will hold. Humans build attacks to kill specifically. We study the target until we find the one point where strength does not matter, and then we put everything we have into that one point. The retired admiral sat down slowly. One of the Fleet Bureau architects had pulled out her own datapad and was running calculations with hands that were visibly trembling. The other was staring at the Sovereign-class hologram as though he had never seen it before. Calloway returned to his seat. He opened his notebook and wrote something in that small, precise handwriting. The seminar dissolved into arguments that lasted for hours, but the essential damage was already done. By evening, I learned that the faculty had classified the seminar recording, the simulation data, the torpedo convergence pattern, the kill geometry analysis. All of it was locked behind a security clearance that no student should have been able to access. But the information was already out. Everyone who had been in that room knew what they had seen, and knowledge like that does not stay contained. I also learned that Calloway had been summoned to the office of the Lyceum Commandant, Admiral Vasis Ron. Not for discipline. The rumor that filtered down through the faculty's assistants was that Ron wanted to know what else Calloway could see in the Union fleet. That night, I sat in my quarters and thought about what had happened. I thought about how every species in the Galactic Union had studied the Sovereign class for generations. Thousands of engineers, admirals, analysts, and strategists had examined every centimeter of that ship, and not one of them had looked at the ventral strip and seen what Calloway saw in his first 6 weeks. Not because they were less intelligent, not because they lacked the technical knowledge, but because they were looking at the ship from the inside out, seeing what the designers intended, seeing strength and purpose and elegant solutions to difficult problems. Calloway looked at it from the outside in. He looked at it the way an enemy would look at it, the way a predator looks at prey, not admiring the muscles or the speed or the sharp horns, but watching the way it moves, studying the way it turns, waiting for the moment when it exposes the spot where the hide is thin and the blood runs close to the surface. He found the kill strip in 6 weeks of casual observation. He was not even looking for it specifically. He just saw it, the way you might glance at a building and notice that one of the support columns is thinner than the rest. It was obvious to him, and the fact that it was obvious, that finding the fatal flaw in the galaxy's greatest warship was routine for a human mind, that was the part that terrified me more than anything else. The summons came the next morning while I was eating breakfast. An official Lyceum communication, priority flagged, addressed to me personally from the Commandant's office. I was to report to Admiral Ron's conference chamber at the 10th hour. No explanation was given. I spent the next 2 hours cycling through every possible reason I might have been called. Had I done something wrong? Had one of my simulation assignments triggered a security flag? Was this about my family's minor political involvement back on Dravon? By the time I arrived at the Commandant's wing, I had convinced myself that my academic career was about to end, for reasons I could not identify. The aide who greeted me was a young Corethian, efficient and expressionless. She led me through 2 security checkpoints and into a chamber I had never seen before. A room deep inside the administrative core of the station, with no windows and walls, that hummed faintly with active signal dampening. This was a secure briefing room, the kind of room where things were discussed that did not officially exist. Admiral Vasis Ron was already seated at the head of a long table. She was Torvon, broad and powerful, even in her advanced years, with the ceremonial scars of a veteran fleet commander tracing patterns across her jaw. Beside her sat 2 civilians I did not recognize, but whose bearing and equipment marked them as engineers from the Union Fleet Bureau. Across from them, alone on his side of the table, sat Calloway. He looked up when I entered and gave me a small nod. Just that, a nod. "Student Kine," Admiral Ron said, "thank you for coming. Sit." I sat. My hands were steady, but only because I was concentrating very hard on keeping them that way. You are here as a student representative, Ron continued. Your academic record is the strongest among current Valith enrollees, and your faculty advisors speak highly of your analytical temperament. I want a junior perspective in this room, someone who can bridge the gap between the theoretical world of the classroom and the practical realities we are about to discuss. You will observe and you may ask questions. Everything you hear in this room is classified under Directive 7. Do you understand what that means? I did. Directive 7 meant that if I disclosed anything discussed here to anyone without explicit authorization, I would face not academic discipline, but criminal prosecution under Union military law. I said I understood. Ron turned to Calloway. Her expression was professional, controlled, but I could see the tension in her posture. She was not accustomed to being unsettled, and she was unsettled now. Mr. Calloway, she said, yesterday you identified a significant structural vulnerability in the Sovereign-class battleship. My question is simple. She paused, and in that pause I heard the weight of an entire fleet behind her words. Is it the only one? Calloway looked at her for a moment. Then he said, Do you want me to be honest, or do you want me to be diplomatic? Honest, Ron said without hesitation. They all have one, Calloway said. Every class of warship in the Union catalog has at least one critical vulnerability that could be exploited with a precision attack. Most of them have more than one. The room was very still. One of the Fleet Bureau engineers, a Draelith woman with silver-streaked skin, leaned forward and said, That is a very broad claim, Mr. Calloway. Can you substantiate it? Give me access to the holotank and your ship catalog, Calloway said, and I will show you. Ron nodded to the aide, who activated the room's central holographic display. It was a military-grade system, far more detailed than the classroom projectors, capable of rendering full internal schematics down to individual wiring conduits. The complete Union ship catalog loaded into the buffer, every class of warship currently in active service. What followed was the most uncomfortable 2 hours of my life. Calloway started with the Veilcore-class cruiser. He rotated the hologram until he found the dorsal array junction, the point where the ship's primary sensor mast connected to the main hull. He showed us that the junction created a sensor shadow, a narrow cone directly above and behind the mast, where the ship's own detection systems could not see. The shadow was small, barely 12 degrees of arc, and under normal circumstances, it was irrelevant, because fleet formations ensured overlapping sensor coverage between ships. But if a ship is operating independently, Calloway said, or if the formation is disrupted during combat, this shadow becomes an approach corridor. A flight of 4 fighters, coming in along this axis at low emission, could reach torpedo range before the cruiser ever detected them. The sensor mast itself blocks the point defense systems from engaging targets in this corridor until they are within 300 meters of the hull. He moved on. The Threnus-class carrier. He highlighted the launch bay door mechanism and showed us how it relied on a single hydraulic rail system with no manual override accessible from inside the ship. A kinetic impactor, even a relatively small one, striking the external rail housing at the right angle, would jam the doors in the closed position. The carrier's entire fighter complement, 64 interceptors, would be trapped inside the ship, unable to launch. A carrier that cannot launch its fighters is not a carrier. It is a very large, very expensive target. The Korath-class destroyer. This one made one of the Fleet Bureau engineers visibly pale. Calloway traced the ammunition feed line for the destroyer's main battery, showing how it ran through an armored conduit for most of its length, but emerged from the protective casing for a stretch of 6 meters, where it passed around the crew quarters section. The original designers had needed the interior space for life support systems, and routing the feed line outside the armored envelope for that short distance had been deemed an acceptable risk. Calloway pointed out that a single precision hit on that 6-meter stretch would not merely disable the main battery. It would detonate the ammunition in the feed line itself, creating a chain reaction that would reach the main magazine within milliseconds. He went through 7 more ship classes. Each time, he found the vulnerability within minutes. Each time, it was something that had been in the design for decades, visible in publicly available schematics, overlooked by every engineer and analyst who had ever reviewed the ship, because they were looking for strengths, not weaknesses. The Corinthian fast frigate had a shield emitter array that created a harmonic blind spot when all emitters fired simultaneously. A gap that lasted for less than a tenth of a second during each shield cycle, but that recurred with perfect regularity. A weapon timed to that cycle would pass through the shields as though they did not exist. Calloway demonstrated by overlaying a timing sequence on the hologram, showing how a single missile launched at the precise moment of harmonic convergence would sail through a shield wall rated to stop 100 simultaneous impacts. The simplicity of it was devastating. A billion-credit shield system defeated by a clock. The Yanvari-class dreadnought had a bridge module that sat atop a narrow structural neck, connecting it to the main hull. The neck was armored, but it was also the sole conduit for all command and control data lines. Sever the neck, and the bridge was physically intact, but completely disconnected from the ship it was supposed to command. The crew on the bridge would be alive, unhurt, watching through their viewports as their ship drifted without orders, because every command signal, every navigation instruction, every weapons authorization ran through a single physical pathway that an enemy could cut with one well-placed shot. The Pellery-class interceptor, the fastest combat vessel in the Union fleet, had engine nacelles that extended beyond the main hull's shield envelope during maximum acceleration. For 3.7 seconds during its attack run, the engines were completely exposed. A point defense battery that knew when to fire could shatter both nacelles and leave the interceptor tumbling through space at a velocity it could no longer control or decelerate from. The Drenathy siege platform, the largest mobile weapons station in the Union arsenal, had a gravitational stabilization system that required 17 seconds to recalibrate after firing its main weapon. During those 17 seconds, the platform could not maneuver. It could not dodge. It could not even rotate to present a different facing to an incoming attack. It sat motionless in space. The most powerful weapon in the galaxy, reduced to the most expensive stationary target ever constructed. 17 seconds. Calloway noted that human fleet exercises routinely practiced attack runs that lasted less than 12. Each revelation landed like a physical blow on the people in the room. I watched the silver-skinned engineer's hands clench and unclench on the table's surface. The other Fleet Bureau engineer had stopped looking at the holotank entirely and was staring at the wall with the blank expression of someone whose professional reality was being dismantled in real time. Admiral Ron sat perfectly still, her Torvon discipline holding her body rigid, but I could see the muscles in her jaw working beneath her scarred skin. The Fleet Bureau engineers had stopped taking notes and were simply staring at the holotank with expressions that oscillated between disbelief and something very close to horror. Admiral Ron's face had gone completely still, in the way that Torvon faces do when they are controlling a very strong emotion. "How?" the silver-skinned engineer finally asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "How are you identifying these so quickly?" Calloway leaned back in his chair and thought about the question for a moment before answering. When he spoke, his tone was patient and precise, like a teacher explaining something fundamental. "I do not look at what is armored," he said. "I look at what is not. Every warship is a collection of compromises. The designers had to choose, at every junction, every transition point, every access hatch, between protection and function. They could not armor everything to maximum thickness because the ship would be too heavy to move. They could not shield everything simultaneously because the power draw would be unsustainable. So they made choices. They prioritized the things they considered most important and reduced coverage on the things they considered less critical." He stood and walked to the holotank, gesturing at the catalog of ships still floating in the air. "The problem is that those choices are visible. If you know what to look for, if you understand that every design has a point of minimum resistance, then finding it is not difficult. You look at the junctions, where different armor sections meet. You look at the transitions, where the hull changes shape or thickness. You look at the access points, the maintenance hatches, the sensor ports, the exhaust vents, any place where the designers had to cut a hole in the armor for something to pass through. And then you ask yourself, if I had one shot, where would I put it?" He looked at Ron. "On Earth, before we ever left our homeworld, we built fortresses, massive stone walls, dozens of meters thick, designed to withstand any attack. And every single one of them fell. Not because the walls were breached by superior force, but because someone found the weak point. A gate that was not as strong as the walls. A sewer grate that was never meant to admit a person but could. A section of wall built on soft ground that could be undermined with tunnels. The lesson we learned, the lesson that is woven into every aspect of human military thinking, is that nothing is impenetrable. Everything has a point of failure. The only question is whether you find it before your enemy does. The room was silent for a long time after that. Then Admiral Ron asked the question that everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to say out loud. Has the human confederacy formally identified these vulnerabilities in our fleet? Calloway did not answer immediately. He stood by the holotank with his hands at his sides, and I watched him weigh his words with the care of someone who understood that what he said next would have consequences far beyond this room. Admiral, he said quietly, I am a third-year cadet. I found these in 6 weeks, using publicly available schematics and a classroom holographic display. What do you think our actual Naval Intelligence Division has found? The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Ron dismissed the session without another word. She turned immediately to a secure communication terminal and began entering commands. I caught a fragment of what appeared on the screen before the aide ushered me toward the door. It was a priority request for an emergency fleet architecture review across all active Union warship classes, flagged at the highest level of urgency I had ever seen on an official document. Calloway walked beside me down the corridor after we left. He seemed unbothered, almost apologetic, like a house guest who had accidentally broken something valuable. I did not mean to cause a panic, he said. I thought someone should ask the question. That is all. I looked at him. This quiet, polite human, with his paper notebook and his graphite stick, who sat in the back of classrooms and said almost nothing, who had been dismissed by an entire academy of the galaxy's brightest minds as a diplomatic curiosity. He had just walked into a room full of senior military officials and disassembled their entire fleet doctrine in 2 hours. And the terrifying part was not that he had found the flaws. The terrifying part was that to him, finding them was not an accomplishment. It was not the result of genius or extraordinary effort. It was routine. It was the absolute first thing he had looked for, because that was what humans did. They looked at strength and saw the shape of the weakness hiding inside it. They looked at armor and saw the gaps. They looked at a fortress and saw the door that should not be there. I walked back to my quarters that evening, carrying a weight I had not carried before. Not fear, exactly, something more complicated than fear. The slow, uncomfortable understanding that the galaxy I had grown up in, the one where the Union's fleet was the unquestioned guarantor of peace and stability, was built on an assumption that had just been proven false. Our ships were not invincible. They had never been invincible. They were full of seams and cracks and thin spots that we had simply never looked for, because it had never occurred to us that anyone would. It had occurred to the humans. It had occurred to them first. That night, I lay in my sleeping alcove and stared at the dark ceiling and tried to understand what it meant. Not the technical implications, those were clear enough, but the deeper meaning, the thing that sat beneath the engineering and the tactics and the fleet reviews. For 4 centuries, the Galactic Union had operated on the belief that its military strength was so overwhelming, so carefully constructed, so thoroughly proven, that no adversary could threaten it at a fundamental level. It was the foundation of our political order, our economic stability, our sense of safety in a galaxy that was vast and dark, and full of things that did not wish us well. And a single human, armed with nothing but his own way of seeing, had shown that the foundation had cracks in it, that the strength we trusted was not the absolute we believed it to be, that somewhere out there, someone was looking at our ships the way Calloway looked at them, finding the thin spots and the seams, and building weapons that would slip through them like water through broken stone. 3 weeks passed after the classified debrief in Admiral Ron's conference room, and the Lyceum settled into a new and uncomfortable equilibrium. On the surface, classes continued as normal. Students attended lectures, completed assignments, argued about hull geometries and weapons loadout optimizations in the dining halls the way they always had. But underneath that surface, something had shifted. A fault line had opened through the institution. Invisible, but felt by everyone. Calloway was moved to a separate tutorial track. The official description was independent study, a category normally reserved for students pursuing specialized research under faculty supervision. Nobody believed that was all it was. Calloway no longer attended regular classes. He was seen entering and leaving the restricted wing of the administrative section at irregular hours, sometimes early in the morning, sometimes late at night. Twice I saw him in the company of officers whose uniforms bore insignia I did not recognize, people from organizations that did not officially have personnel stationed at the Lyceum. I tried not to think about it too much. I had my own coursework to manage, my own career to protect. But the thoughts kept returning, usually late at night, when the station dimmed its lighting to simulate planetary darkness. I would lie in my sleeping alcove and stare at the ceiling and wonder what Calloway was working on in those restricted rooms, and what it meant that the people asking him questions were no longer professors. Then the alert hit. I was in the materials science laboratory when the station's emergency communication system activated. The alert tone was one I had only ever heard during drills, a deep, pulsing sound that meant a significant military event had occurred somewhere in Union space. All non-essential activities were to cease. All students were to return to their quarters. All faculty were to report to their department heads. The details came in fragments over the next several hours, pieced together from official bulletins, and the frantic information sharing that happened whenever the student body was confined to quarters, with nothing to do but speculate. A Union border flotilla had engaged a Nethru Dominion raiding force in the Caliston Reach, a contested region along the Galactic Western Arm, where Nethru incursions had been escalating for months. The flotilla was substantial. 12 warships, including 2 Sovereign-class battleships. The Nethru force was smaller and should have been outmatched. The engagement should have lasted minutes. It lasted 11 seconds. The Nethru deployed a weapon system that no Union intelligence analyst had predicted. A salvo-linked torpedo array that fired in tight, staggered clusters of 3, each cluster converging on a single point. The targeting was precise, to a degree that the Union's combat AI systems had never been designed to counter, because no known adversary had ever demonstrated that level of coordinated accuracy. They aimed for the ventral strip. The lead Sovereign-class battleship, a vessel called the Unbroken Tide, with a crew of 1,400, took the full cluster directly on the section Calloway had identified in his classroom simulation 3 weeks earlier. The first torpedo collapsed the localized shields. The second cracked the thinned armor. The third reached the reactor housing and detonated. The Unbroken Tide died in 1.4 seconds, 0.2 of a second slower than Calloway's simulation had predicted, because the ship had been running at partial reactor output at the time of impact. If it had been at full power, the thermal stress on the housing would have made the breach even faster. 1,400 crew, gone in less time than it takes to draw a breath. The sensor records from the other ships in the flotilla showed the Unbroken Tide there one moment, and then simply not there the next, replaced by an expanding sphere of light and debris that briefly outshone the nearest star. The ship did not break apart gradually. It did not list and burn and give its crew time to reach escape pods. The reactor breach was total and instantaneous. 1,400 lives ended between one heartbeat and the next, on a ship that was supposed to be unkillable, destroyed by a weapon that was not even particularly powerful. The torpedoes were standard yield. There was nothing special about them. What was special was where they hit. The second Sovereign, the Pillar of Korath, survived only because its captain had apparently read the classified briefing that Admiral Ron had distributed to fleet commanders after the debrief. When the torpedo cluster launched, the captain rolled the ship hard, presenting the heavier dorsal plating to the incoming salvo. The torpedoes hit the thickest section of the triple-layered hull and were absorbed. The ship sustained heavy damage but held together. 3 other vessels in the flotilla were hit with similar precision attacks, targeting their own specific vulnerabilities. The Nethru force withdrew immediately after the strike, taking no losses. They had not come for a battle. They had come for a demonstration. The Lyceum went into lockdown. For 48 hours, no one entered or left the station. The dining halls served emergency rations. Classes were suspended indefinitely. Faculty members moved through the corridors with the tight, controlled expressions of people who were processing information they were not yet allowed to share. I spent those 2 days in my quarters, refreshing the news feed every few minutes, reading the same sparse official bulletins over and over again, trying to extract meaning from their careful, bloodless language. Significant fleet engagement, casualties sustained, tactical review underway, 1,400 crew on the unbroken tide alone, and the bulletin called it casualties sustained, as though the words could make the number smaller. I kept thinking about Callaway's simulation, the holographic Sovereign class breaking apart in the classroom, the timer reading 1.2 seconds, and how the entire room had watched it happen in a context that felt academic, theoretical, safely distant from reality. Now 1,400 beings were dead in 1.4 seconds, and the difference between Callaway's simulation and reality was 0.2 of a second and the weight of actual lives. Around me, the Lyceum processed the news the way any institution does when its foundational beliefs are shattered. Some students retreated into denial, insisting the Nethru had simply gotten lucky, that the attack was a fluke that would never be repeated. Others swung to the opposite extreme, declaring that the entire Union fleet was worthless, that every ship should be scrapped and rebuilt from the hull up. Neither response was useful. Neither response addressed the actual problem. I did not see Callaway for the first 2 days. Then, on the third morning after the attack, I found him in a laboratory that should have been locked but was not. He was alone, surrounded by holographic displays showing data I should not have been able to see. Engagement telemetry, weapon signature analysis, the final sensor logs of the unbroken tide. He did not seem surprised to see me. He did not ask how I had gotten in. He just looked at me with an expression that was neither calm nor panicked, but something in between. The focused intensity of someone working a problem that had suddenly become very real. The Nethru did not figure this out themselves, he said. I stood in the doorway, trying to decide whether to stay or leave, whether being in this room was going to end my career or change it. I stayed. What do you mean? I asked. Callaway pulled up a display showing the torpedo clustering pattern used in the attack. 3 trajectories, converging on a single point, staggered at precise intervals. The geometry was clean. Too clean. The Nethru are aggressive, Callaway said, but they are not precision thinkers. Their weapons doctrine for the past century has been built around saturation fire. Overwhelm the target with volume. They do not design weapons for surgical strikes because their entire military philosophy is based on brute force. This clustering algorithm was not developed by Nethru engineers. It is too optimized, too perfectly calibrated to the specific dimensions of the Sovereign's ventral strip. Someone gave it to them. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Someone who had access to the same schematics you studied. Or better, Callaway said. This firing solution accounts for variables I did not include in my classroom simulation. Shield cycling rates. Structural resonance frequencies of the specific alloy used in the ventral plating. Whoever designed this attack had detailed technical knowledge of the Sovereign class at a level that goes beyond publicly available data. He closed the torpedo analysis and opened a broader tactical display showing the full engagement. The Nethru force had entered the Khalistan Reach through a jump corridor that placed them at an optimal attack angle relative to the Union flotilla's formation. They had known where the Union ships would be. They had known which ships to target first. They had known exactly where to aim. This was not a raid, Callaway said. This was a proof of concept. Someone wanted to demonstrate that the Union fleet's vulnerabilities could be exploited in actual combat. The Nethru were the delivery mechanism, but the intelligence behind the attack came from somewhere else. I leaned against the doorframe because my legs were not entirely steady. Who? I do not know yet, but that is not the immediate problem. He turned to face me fully, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw urgency in his eyes. The immediate problem is that every hostile power in the galaxy is going to study this engagement. The Nethru just proved that precision strikes against known structural vulnerabilities work. The ventral strip is no longer a classified weakness. It is a demonstrated kill technique. And it is not just the Sovereign. If anyone starts looking at the other Union ship classes the way I did, he did not need to finish the sentence. The entire fleet was a catalog of targets, and the catalog had just been opened. You need to patch the armor, I said, grasping at the most obvious solution. You need to do more than that, Calloway said. Patching the ventral strip solves one problem on one ship class, but the design philosophy that created the vulnerability is present in every ship the Union has ever built. You do not armor against specific attacks. You assume that any section of the hull might be the point of failure, and you design the ship to survive it. That is impossible, I said. You cannot make every section equally strong. The thermal constraints alone. I am not talking about making every section equally strong, Calloway said. I am talking about changing what happens after the armor fails. Right now, when a sovereign class takes a breach in the ventral strip, the damage propagates inward toward the reactor, because there is nothing between the hull and the reactor housing designed to contain or redirect the energy of an internal explosion. The ship is built on the assumption that the armor will hold. When it does not hold, there is no second line of defense. He pulled up a schematic I had never seen before. It was not a Union design. The hull geometry was different, the proportions unfamiliar, the internal layout radically unlike anything I had studied. This is a human frigate, Calloway said. The Kestrel class. It is 1/8 the size of a sovereign and carries 1/10 the firepower. But look at the internal architecture. I looked. The ship was divided into dozens of small, independent compartments, each one sealed and self-contained. Critical systems, the reactor, the main computers, the life support cores, were not concentrated in a single protected zone. They were distributed throughout the ship, with multiple redundant copies, each accessible through different physical pathways. The corridors between compartments were not straight. They bent and angled in ways that seemed inefficient, until I realized that the bends were designed to redirect blast energy, channeling an explosion along predetermined paths that led to sacrificial hull sections rather than toward vital systems. Every compartment is a standalone survival unit, Calloway said. If a section is destroyed, the adjacent sections continue to function. The crew can fight from whatever remains of the ship. We build blast channels into the structure that direct explosive force outward through panels designed to blow away, rather than inward toward things that matter. We assume that the hull will be breached. We assume that crew will be killed. We design the ship so that it can keep fighting after those things happen. I stared at the schematic for a long time. It was ugly. It was inelegant. It lacked the clean, symmetrical beauty of Union warship design. Every line was pragmatic. Every angle calculated not for aesthetics, but for survival, under the worst possible conditions. It was the most effective warship architecture I had ever seen. You build ships that know how to bleed, I said. Calloway looked at me with something that might have been respect. Yes, he said. That is exactly what we do. A priority communication arrived before either of us could say anything more. It was addressed to Calloway, and it did not come from the Lyceum administration or from Admiral Ron. It came directly from Union Fleet Command, the supreme military authority of the Galactic Union, headquartered at the Arch of Corinth, a station so restricted that most Union citizens did not know its location. They wanted Calloway there. Immediately. He gathered his things, which amounted to his notebook and a single data chip. As he headed for the door, he paused and turned back to me. When I get back, he said, remind me to show you what human warships look like from the inside. You will understand why we build different. Then he was gone, and I was alone in the lab with the holographic ghost of a human frigate hanging in the air, its ugly, brilliant, life-saving architecture slowly rotating in the blue light. I did not see Calloway for 11 days. During that time, the galaxy changed, not with a single dramatic event, but with a series of strikes that fell like hammer blows on the Union's sense of security. The Nethru, emboldened by their success in the Khalistan Reach, launched 3 more precision attacks along the border. The first targeted a patrol group in the Valith Corridor, my own people's territory. A Veilcore-class cruiser was operating at the edge of the formation, slightly separated from its escorts by a navigational error that had opened a gap of less than 30 seconds in the sensor overlap. A Nethru strike wing, 4 fast attack craft, entered through the dorsal sensor shadow that Calloway had identified in the debrief. They reached torpedo range without being detected and put 3 rounds into the cruiser's reactor cooling system. The ship did not explode. It simply went dark, every system failing in cascade as the reactor shut down to prevent a core breach. The crew survived, but the cruiser was a dead hulk, towed back to port by the escorts that arrived too late to prevent the attack. The cruiser's captain later testified that she never saw the enemy, not once. They came through a blind spot that was not supposed to exist, fired from a position that was not supposed to be reachable, and vanished before the escorts could respond. A warship that cost more than the annual economic output of some member worlds, rendered useless by 4 small craft that knew where not to be seen. The second strike hit a convoy in the Meridian transit, 3 Korath-class destroyers escorting a supply fleet. The Nethru did not attack the convoy itself. They attacked a single destroyer with a weapon package designed to hit the exposed ammunition feed line, the 6-meter stretch that ran outside the armored citadel. The precision was surgical. A single modified torpedo, low yield but extremely accurate, detonated against the feed housing. The ammunition inside cooked off in a chain that reached the main magazine in less than a second. The destroyer simply ceased to exist. 230 crew. No survivors. The explosion was so complete that the debris field contained no piece of the ship larger than a cargo crate. The other 2 destroyers broke formation to search for wreckage, and were ambushed by a secondary Nethru force that had been waiting for exactly that response. One was crippled, the other fought free, but sustained damage that would take months to repair. The third strike was the most sophisticated. A Threnus-class carrier, operating near the Khalistan Reach, was approached by what appeared to be a civilian freighter transmitting a Union merchant identification code. When the carrier launched a fighter patrol to inspect the freighter, the approaching vessel fired a single kinetic impactor at the carrier's launch bay door mechanism. The projectile was small and low-powered, designed not to destroy the door, but to jam the external rail system. It worked. The rail buckled, the doors locked in a partially closed position, and 64 interceptors were trapped inside the carrier's launch bays. The pilots sat in their cockpits, engines hot, weapons armed, completely helpless. They could hear the battle raging outside the hull and could do nothing about it. The Nethru attack force arrived 4 minutes later. The carrier, unable to launch its fighters and relying solely on its point defense systems, was battered into submission and nearly captured before reinforcements arrived. The captain later reported that the most agonizing sound she had ever heard was 64 fighter pilots on the internal communication channel, calling for the doors to open, while the hull shuddered under impacts the ship was never designed to absorb alone. Every wound landed exactly where Calloway had said it would. Every vulnerability he had identified in that 2-hour debrief was now being exploited in actual combat. The classified report had not leaked. The Nethru were simply demonstrating that they had access to the same analytical approach, the same way of seeing weaknesses that Calloway had tried to warn the Union about. The Lyceum became a pressure chamber. I watched colleagues and faculty fracture along lines I had not known existed. Some blamed Calloway, irrationally insisting that his analysis had somehow given the Nethru the information they needed. This was impossible, and anyone who thought about it, clearly for more than 10 seconds knew it was impossible. But fear does not require logic. Others blamed the fleet architects, arguing that decades of complacency had created a navy of beautiful, vulnerable ships that could not survive contact with an enemy that thought differently. Faculty meetings became shouting matches. Students formed factions. The Drelith, whose species had led the design teams for most of the vulnerable ship classes, took the criticism personally and dug in. The Torvan, whose military culture valued practical results above theoretical elegance, grew increasingly vocal in their demand for immediate design changes. The Valith, my own people, were caught somewhere in between, torn between our pride in the hull architectures we had helped create and the undeniable evidence that those architectures contained flaws we had never seen. Friendships dissolved, study groups broke apart along species lines. I overheard a Drelith student in the corridor calling Calloway a destroyer, as though identifying a flaw and creating it were the same act. A Torvan cadet responded that the real destroyer was not the one who found the crack, but the one who built the wall with a crack in it and called it perfect. They nearly came to blows before a faculty member stepped between them. I tried to stay neutral. I tried to focus on my studies. But the studies themselves had become irrelevant. Every hull geometry I had memorized, every armor calculation I had mastered, every design principle I had been taught. All of it was built on the assumption that had just been shattered. I could not look at a warship schematic anymore without seeing what Calloway saw. The thin spots, the junctions, the seams where protection gave way to function and left a gap wide enough for a torpedo to slip through. On the 12th day, the announcement came. Union Fleet Command issued a galaxy-wide fleet directive, the first of its kind in over 60 years. It was designated the Ron Calloway Mandate, named jointly for Admiral Vayus Ron, who had initiated the Emergency Fleet Architecture Review, and Grant Calloway, the third-year human cadet who had triggered it. The naming itself was historic. Directives of this magnitude were normally named after admirals and senior fleet architects, not cadets from allied species who had been enrolled for less than a semester. The mandate had three components. The first was immediate. Every Union warship in active service was ordered to implement emergency armor modifications to address the specific vulnerabilities identified in the fleet review. The ventral strip on all Sovereign-class battleships was to receive additional plating and a redesigned thermal dispersal system that maintained heat management without compromising structural integrity. The Veilcore-class sensor shadow was to be eliminated with supplementary array nodes. The Korath-class ammunition feed was to be rerouted entirely inside the armored citadel. The Threnus-class launch bay doors were to receive redundant manual overrides and hardened rail housings. Every identified weakness, across every ship class, was to be patched within 90 days. The second component was structural. All future Union warship designs were to incorporate what the mandate called adversarial architecture review, a process directly adapted from human military engineering. Before any new warship class could enter production, a dedicated team of analysts would be tasked with finding every possible kill geometry in the design. Their job was to attack the ship on paper, to find every thin spot and every seam and every compromise, before an enemy could find them in combat. The team would be staffed by officers trained specifically in vulnerability analysis, a discipline that had never existed in the Union military before, but that had been standard practice in human navies for centuries. The third component was the most radical, and it was the one that generated the most controversy. The mandate ordered a fundamental change in warship design philosophy. Future Union ships were to be designed not on the assumption that their armor would hold, but on the assumption that it would be breached. Internal compartmentalization, blast channeling, distributed redundancy, sacrificial hull sections, every concept that Calloway had described in that laboratory were to be incorporated into the next generation of Union warships. The ships would be heavier, they would be more expensive, they would be less elegant, but they would survive things that current designs could not. Calloway returned to the Lyceum the afternoon the mandate was published. I was in the observation gallery overlooking the main docking bay when I saw his transport arrive. He walked off the shuttle with the same unhurried stride he had always had, his notebook tucked under one arm, looking exactly like the quiet exchange student who had sat in the back of Professor Yaeth Morin's classroom 7 weeks ago and said nothing. But things were different now. I could see it in the way the docking bay crew looked at him. Not with the polite indifference they had shown before, with a kind of careful attention, the way people look at someone they are still trying to understand, but have learned to take very seriously. I met him in the corridor outside the dining hall. He looked tired, not exhausted, but worn in a way I had not seen before, the kind of fatigue that comes from intense, sustained mental effort over many days. There were lines around his eyes that had not been there before, and his notebook, the same notebook he had carried since his first day at the Lyceum, was visibly thicker, its pages swollen with dense handwriting and sketches. 11 days, I said. 11 days, he agreed, in a sealed room with 40 of the Union's best naval architects, redesigning everything. How did it go? He leaned against the corridor wall and closed his eyes for a moment, and I saw in that brief gesture how much the experience had cost him. Not just the work itself, but the weight of being the person in the room, who saw things no one else could see, who understood dangers that no one else had imagined, who had to convince 40 brilliant minds to abandon the foundations of their professional lives. At first, they resisted, he said, not because they disagreed with the analysis, but because accepting it meant accepting that 400 years of design tradition was built on a flawed assumption. That is a difficult thing to ask someone to absorb, especially when they have spent their entire career building on that tradition. They had poured years of their lives into those designs. Telling them their ships could be killed in seconds was not an intellectual exercise for them. It was personal. What changed? I showed them the Kestrel, he said. The human frigate. I walked them through the internal architecture, compartment by compartment. I showed them the blast channels and the distributed systems and the redundant pathways. And then I ran a simulation. The same 3-torpedo scenario I ran in Professor Morin's seminar, but against the Kestrel instead of the Sovereign. What happened? The torpedoes breached the hull. 2 compartments were destroyed. 17 simulated crew were killed. The blast channeling redirected the explosion outward through a sacrificial panel on the port side. The reactor was undamaged. The main weapons remained operational. Life support continued in all surviving compartments. The ship was hurt, badly hurt, but it kept fighting. He paused and looked at me with an expression I had trouble reading. That was the moment they understood, he said. Not when I showed them the weakness. When I showed them a ship that was built to survive its own wounds. They had never seen anything like it. They were horrified at first, because to Union sensibilities, designing a ship on the assumption that it will be damaged is almost offensive. It implies failure. It implies that your engineering is not good enough to prevent the breach. But it also implies survival, I said. Yes, and that is what won them over. Not the theory. The fact that a human frigate 1/8 the size of a Sovereign could take the same hit that killed 1,400 crew and lose 17. We walked in silence for a while. The station's artificial daylight was dimming toward its evening cycle, and the corridors were quiet. There is a concept in human military philosophy, Calloway said. We call it the doctrine of scars. The idea that a warship is not finished being designed until you have imagined every way it can be wounded and built the answer into the bones. Every scar, every potential breach, every place where the armor might fail. You design for that failure specifically. You do not pretend it will not happen. You accept that it will, and you make the ship strong enough to survive it. That is a very different way of thinking, I said. It comes from a very different history, Calloway said. We have been fighting wars for as long as our species has existed, longer than we have had writing, longer than we have had cities. We have fought on land, and on water, and in the air, and in space. And the one lesson that runs through all of it, the single constant that has never changed in 10,000 years of warfare, is that nothing is unbreakable. Everything falls eventually. The side that wins is not the side that builds the strongest walls. It is the side that learns to keep fighting after the walls come down. That evening, Professor Yaeth Morin held his final lecture on hull integrity for the semester. I almost did not attend. I was exhausted, mentally and emotionally drained by weeks of upheaval. But something made me go, a sense that this was important, that whatever Yaeth had to say would be worth hearing. The hall was not as crowded as the seminar had been, but it was close. Calloway was there, sitting in the front row this time. Yaeth stood at the podium, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. He simply looked out at the students, these young minds from 32 species, who had come to his institution to learn how to build the ships that protected civilization. And I could see in his face the weight of everything that had happened. He looked older than he had 12 weeks ago. The confidence that had radiated from him like heat from a star had been replaced by something quieter, something harder, something that looked very much like humility. Then he activated the holographic display. The ship that appeared was recognizable as a Sovereign-class battleship, but it was not the Sovereign I had studied for 2 years. The ventral strip was heavier, yes, the most obvious change, but the transformation went far deeper than additional armor plating. The internal architecture had been completely reimagined. Where the original design showed a central reactor chamber surrounded by open passages leading to the main systems, the new design showed a distributed network of compartments, each sealed, each self-contained, connected by corridors that angled and turned in ways that would redirect blast energy outward rather than inward. Sacrificial hull sections were marked in a different color, panels designed to blow away under pressure, venting explosive force into space rather than allowing it to propagate through the ship's interior. The reactor housing was surrounded by 3 independent containment shells, each capable of holding a breach on its own. The ammunition storage had been broken into dozens of small, isolated magazines, each connected to its weapon system by a feed line that ran entirely inside the armored citadel, with physical cutoff valves at every junction. It was not beautiful. It lacked the clean symmetry that had made the original Sovereign an icon of Union engineering. It was heavy and angular and pragmatic, every line serving a function, every angle calculated for survival under conditions that the original designers had never imagined, because they had never believed such conditions were possible. But it was alive. You could look at that ship and know, instinctively, that it was built to survive things that would kill any other vessel in the fleet. It was a warship that had been designed with full knowledge of its own mortality, and that knowledge had made it stronger. Yates ran a simulation without being asked. The same 3-torpedo scenario Callaway had demonstrated weeks ago. The torpedoes struck the redesigned ventral section. The outer armor absorbed the first impact. The second breached the hull. But instead of reaching the reactor, the blast energy was caught by the channeling architecture and redirected laterally through 2 sacrificial panels that blew outward into space, taking the explosive force with them. The reactor's first containment shell cracked, the second held, the third was untouched. The ship lost 2 compartments. 31 simulated crew were killed. But the reactor continued operating. The weapons remained online. The engines were undamaged. The ship was wounded, badly wounded, but it was fighting. The simulation timer at the moment of full stabilization read 4.7 seconds. In 4.7 seconds, the redesigned Sovereign had taken the hit that killed the unbroken tide and survived it. Yates looked at the hologram for a long moment. Then he turned to the class and spoke. "For 400 years, he said, we built ships to be unbreakable. We poured our finest minds and our greatest resources into making armor thicker, shields stronger, weapons more powerful. We believed that if we made our ships strong enough, nothing could touch them. And for 400 years, no one challenged that belief." He paused and looked at Callaway. One human, sitting in the back of this room with a notebook and a piece of graphite, challenged it in 6 weeks. Not because he was smarter than us, not because he knew something we did not, but because he looked at our ships the way we never thought to look at them. He looked at them the way an enemy would. Yates turned back to the hologram, the redesigned Sovereign rotating slowly in the blue light. "This is what we learned. Not how to build better armor. Not how to make stronger shields. We learned to build ships that know how to bleed and keep fighting. Ships that accept their own vulnerability and are stronger for it. That is the human lesson. That is what 400 years of engineering excellence missed, and what one cadet from a species we barely took seriously taught us in a single semester." He dismissed the class without ceremony. Students filed out in near silence, each carrying the weight of what they had just seen, each quietly recalculating everything they thought they knew about the ships they would one day design. I did not leave immediately. I stayed in the observation gallery after the others had gone, standing at the long window that looked out over the orbital shipyard adjacent to the station. In the cold light of a distant star, I could see the shapes of Union warships in their berths, some of them already being recalled for the refit mandated by the directive. Scaffolding was going up around a Sovereign-class vessel, tiny figures of engineering drones swarming its hull, beginning the long process of rebuilding a ship that had been considered perfect 12 weeks ago. I thought about that first day. Callaway sitting in the back row, silent, his notebook open, his eyes moving over the holographic schematics with that quiet, patient attention that I had mistaken for passivity. He had not been passive, he had been learning. Not the way we learned, absorbing principles and admiring elegant solutions. He had been studying the patient, as he had put it, learning the body, finding the places where the skin was thin and the bones were close to the surface. 6 weeks, that was all it had taken. 6 weeks of sitting quietly in classrooms, looking at the same schematics that thousands of students had studied before him. He did not have access to classified data. He did not use advanced analytical software. He used his eyes and a notebook and a piece of graphite, and he saw what 400 years of the galaxy's finest minds had missed. Because he was asking a different question. We asked, how does this ship protect itself? Calloway asked, how does this ship die? And the answer to that second question, it turned out, was far more important than the answer to the first. Every other species in the galaxy designed for war as an event, something terrible that happened, and that you built defenses against in the hope that your defenses would hold. Humans designed for war as a discipline, something to be studied and mastered and won, something that required not just strength but understanding, not just armor but awareness. They did not build walls and hope nothing got through. They built walls, and then spent years imagining every possible way those walls could fail. And they built answers for each one. The difference between those two philosophies was a thin strip of missing armor on the belly of the most powerful warship ever built. A strip that thousands of engineers had seen and accepted and never questioned, because questioning it would have required them to think like the enemy, and thinking like the enemy was something that, until now, only the humans did. I thought about the 1,400 crew of the Unbroken Tide. I thought about the 230 on the Korath-class destroyer that had been reduced to pieces no larger than a cargo crate. I thought about all the beings on all the ships that had been damaged and crippled and destroyed, because no one had ever sat down with a schematic and asked the simple, devastating question that Calloway had asked in his first month at the Lyceum. Those lives were not lost because our ships were poorly built. They were lost because our ships were built by people who could not imagine their own defeat. And that failure of imagination, that inability to see strength as anything other than an absolute, was a weakness more dangerous than any thin strip of armor. I reached into the bag at my side and pulled out the notebook I had purchased that morning from the small human supply store on the station's commercial level. It was a simple thing: bound paper, blank pages, no electronics, no data connection, primitive by any galactic standard. I had also purchased one of the graphite writing implements, and I held it now in my fingers, feeling its unfamiliar weight. I opened the notebook to the first page and began to sketch. Not a warship as it was designed to be. Not the clean lines and elegant curves I had been trained to draw for 2 years. I drew a warship as an enemy would see it. I marked the junctions where armor sections met. I highlighted the transitions where thickness changed. I circled the access points and the sensor ports and the maintenance hatches, every place where the designers had made a choice between protection and function. Then I drew lines converging on those points. Attack vectors, kill geometries, the shapes of the wounds that had not been inflicted yet, but that someone, somewhere, was already calculating. It was not a comfortable exercise. It went against everything I had been taught, every instinct I had as a Valith hull architect. We were builders. We created. We did not imagine destruction. But Calloway had shown me something I could not unlearn. The builders who imagine destruction build things that survive it. And the builders who do not, who trust in the strength of their creation and never ask where it might fail, build things that die in 1.2 seconds when someone finally asks the question they never thought to ask. I kept drawing. The graphite scratched against the paper in the quiet of the observation gallery, and outside the window, the shipyard blazed with the light of welding torches as the fleet that had protected the galaxy for 400 years was slowly, painfully, painstakingly rebuilt. Not to be unbreakable, to be unkillable. There is a difference. A human taught us that.